Let me show you, watching at home this morning, some of the numerous stories in our papers here about the Blackwater security company, which is doing private contracting work in Iraq. Here's the Christian Science Monitor front page, Private Security in Iraq, Whose Rules? And from the Philadelphia Inquirer, Maliki condemns deaths of Iraqis in cold blood. And further on in the USA Today, Iraqi leaders suggest U.S. Embassy cut ties with Blackwater. And from the New York Times, Maliki alleges 7 cases when Blackwater killed Iraqis. Our next guest is an investigative journalist who has just finished a book about Blackwater, and he is joining us now from New York City. His name is Jeremy Scahill. He's the author of Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. Mr. Scahill, based on your reporting, are you surprised at the frictions between the Iraqi government and the U.S. government over the Blackwater Services Group?
Oh, not at all. I mean, this is, in fact, this is the 4th such incident involving Blackwater operatives in just the last 9 months. The Iraqi government is alleging that they have documentation that there have been 7 of these incidents. Last Christmas Eve, inside the Green Zone, a Blackwater contractor who was off duty allegedly shot and killed the bodyguard for the Iraqi Vice President Adel Abdel Mahdi. Blackwater responded to that by simply whisking the contractor out of the country, and to this day, he's not been publicly charged with a crime. This past May, Blackwater operatives engaged in back-to-back firefights in a crowded Baghdad neighborhood outside of the Interior Ministry. That escalated tensions. And then, of course, we had this horrible tragedy that occurred this past Sunday, where the Iraqis are now saying as many as 20 people may have died, among them a couple and their infant child. So clearly this has been a pattern of Wild West cowboy tactics that's gone on for all 4 years of the occupation. What's interesting now is that the Iraqi government has been overwhelmingly silent on the issue of these private forces in Iraq, and now it appears as though the Maliki government is acting as though there's some degree of sovereignty with his government.
For people, we get calls regularly mentioning the name Blackwater, but let's do a bit of a primer about not just Blackwater, but the other 2 major companies that provide security services, how they got their contracts, who owns these companies, and what kind of work they do in Iraq.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that's happened in post-invasion, current occupation Iraq is that there's been an absolute boon in the world of private security. In fact, the Times of London said that in post-war Iraq, it's not oil that's the major industry, it's in fact private security. And many of the companies that are now operating in Iraq as private security or private military companies didn't even exist a few years ago. Blackwater itself was founded in 1996, and originally it was sort of envisioned as a sportsman's paradise and a law enforcement and military training facility on the Great Dismal Swamp of North Carolina. Following 9/11, the company was hired by the Central Intelligence Agency to send a small team of special forces operators inside of Afghanistan. And when the Bush administration sent Paul Bremer into Baghdad in 2003, it wasn't the U.S. military that would be tasked with keeping alive a man that many Iraqis hated and compared to Saddam Hussein. Blackwater was awarded a $27 million no-bid contract. To date, Blackwater has been contracted for about $800 million in security services, and it really has risen to become the sort of official mercenary company of the U.S. occupation, if you will. They protect Ambassador Ryan Crocker. In fact, they've kept alive every single U.S. ambassador to serve in post-invasion Iraq. They guard Condoleezza Rice when she goes into Baghdad, as well as congressional delegations. This is a very serious incident right now because Blackwater isn't just any company. We're talking about the elite personal bodyguards for the U.S. ambassador of Iraq.
And are they funded from Defense Department or from State Department monies?
Well, many people erroneously believe that Blackwater has been hired by the Pentagon, but in fact it's the U.S. State Department that hires Blackwater through its division of diplomatic security. And the owner of Blackwater is a man named Eric Prince, who's a very right-wing evangelical Christian who's poured a lot of money into the campaign coffers of President Bush and his political allies. And that certainly is another reason, I think, why a lot of people pay close attention to the kinds of contracts that Blackwater has been winning under the so-called war on terror.
And if you looked in terms of estimated numbers, how many, you call them mercenaries, how many private contractors are there estimated to be in Iraq providing security services?
Right. Well, this is a matter of great debate. In fact, I testified in front of Congress at the Defense Authorization Committee this past May. And I watched as representatives asked government officials, military officials, that exact question you're asking me, and no one's been able to come forward with a straight answer. The Congressional Research Service, which is an independent research entity of the U.S. government, recently estimated that there were about 30,000 so-called private security contractors working on behalf of the U.S. government. My understanding from some independent sources is that that number may be as high as 70,000 when you look at the layers of subcontracts in Iraq. The broader picture, though, is that there are about 180,000 private contractors that do everything from peel potatoes to the armed work that Blackwater does. And they're operating along about 170,000 U.S. troops. So that now means that the U.S. military is the junior partner in this coalition that's occupying Iraq. And the senior partner is not another nation state. It's in fact a corporate army made up of about 630 companies.
Jeremy Scahill joins us live from New York City. Let's get to your telephone calls. Our topic is on Blackwater and their security services that they provide in Iraq, and what are their operating rules and who has oversight for the work that they do. Some of the questions being asked in light of the most recent incident in Iraq and the tensions that it has caused between the U.S. and Iraqi government. Here are the phone numbers: 202-737-0002 for Democrats, for Republicans 202-628-0001, and for Independents 202-628-0205. As our calls are coming in, Mr. Scahill, will you talk a bit about whose rules they are required to follow when they work on the ground in Iraq?
Well, the technical rules that govern these private forces in Iraq do differ slightly from those of the U.S. military, the active duty soldiers. These contractors are only supposed to engage in defensive operations, and the primary task that a company like Blackwater has in Iraq is to keep alive or to protect its noun, whether it's a person, place, or a thing. Most often it's a diplomat or an official of the occupation traveling from point A to point B. And this is where the waters get muddy. Because if an Iraqi vehicle veers too close to a Blackwater convoy and the Blackwater operatives say, well, we think that might be a suicide bomber, and they open fire and, oh, it turns out that it was actually a couple and their small child, was the perceived threat actual or real? The fact is that these so-called rules of engagement under which these guys operate are oftentimes thrown out the window, and we've seen numerous instances of indiscriminate fire against Iraqis, not just on the part of Blackwater, but on the part of many of the security contractors. The major problem right now is the issue of accountability. When these guys shoot and kill someone, who's going to prosecute them? Who's going to go after them? The U.S., when Paul Bremer was in Iraq in 2003, 2004, issued an edict known as Order 17, which essentially banned the Iraqi government from prosecuting any contractors for crimes committed in Iraq in the Iraqi court system. And so right now, the only option for prosecuting misconduct or criminal activity on the part of these contractors would be U.S. civilian law. And the theory behind it is that U.S. investigators will go over to Iraq, they'll investigate the crime, they'll arrest the individual in question, they'll bring them back to the United States, and they'll try them in a U.S. civilian court. I mean, it looks interesting on paper, totally unenforceable. The other option is to put them in the court-martial system, which of course would face a lot of constitutional challenges. But the real crisis right now in Iraq is that the Iraqi government is saying that it has the right to prosecute these individuals based on Sunday's incident in Iraqi courts. And I think what we're going to find is that Blackwater will try to take those individuals out of the country, perhaps on orders from the U.S. government, so that they would avoid a scenario where U.S. mercenaries would appear in Iraqi courts.
We did ask representatives of Blackwater to appear on the program, and although they have in the past, they have declined given the pending investigation. Jeremy Scahill is the author of this new book in bookstores right now called Blackwater. Let's get to calls for him, beginning with one from Riverside, California on the Republican line. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. You have a very intriguing and right-on book there. It's really bold and very needed, this information. I was wondering if you had a clue whatsoever about the 800-plus detention camps here in America that are already staffed and armed, and KBR got this contract, and it's like they already know why they're there. They're armed, and it's like they're waiting for, some event or something to fulfill all these camps. The one in, I believe it's Alaska, holds 200,000. Would you know anything about those? And I believe 911 was an inside job, according to all logical information. Thank you.
Well, what I could say about that is that we're certainly in this country in the midst of the most radical privatization agenda in the history of our nation, and we certainly see it in our schools, we see it with prisons, we see it in law enforcement, and now we're seeing it in a very unprecedented way on the battlefield in Iraq. And one of the next frontiers of this, of course, is going to be the Border Patrol. There are several of these mercenary companies that operate in Iraq that are itching to put their men as a sort of privatized Border Patrol on U.S. government contract on the U.S. border. And certainly the prison system in this country is increasingly privatized. So what we're seeing in Iraq is very much indicative of a trend that began during the administration of George H.W. Bush and was certainly supported through 2 terms of the Clinton administration, and now has exploded under the current Bush administration.
This from the New York Times this morning. Publicly, the Bush administration has not said how it would respond if the Maliki government tries to carry out its threat to evict Blackwater. But administration officials and executives in both security contracting industry said Wednesday that they believe that the White House and the State Department would seek to block any move by Iraq to force the company out. The issue is already leading to sharp tensions between the governments, and any effort by the United States to force Iraq to keep Blackwater could make the Maliki government appear to be a weak puppet. Will you comment on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, what we understand in the last 24 hours is now the U.S. government has ordered all of its personnel not to travel outside of the heavily fortified green zone for fear that there are going to be reprisal attacks against Blackwater guarded convoys. So in addition to the demand of or the suggestion by the Maliki government that they're going to expel Blackwater or that they want another company to take over the security for the U.S. Embassy, we have a very real political problem for the Bush administration, or some would say a real military problem for the diplomats, because now Blackwater has a visibility that the company, it's a nightmare for Blackwater right now, because now their name is known all throughout Iraq and the Arab world, and whenever they're escorting a convoy, the risk is going to be escalated. So it also could boil down to a practicality that Blackwater simply won't be able to perform its duties for the U.S. government in Iraq, because it now has been accused of killing 20 Iraqi civilians, and certainly all Iraqis now have heard the name Blackwater.
You talk about the warnings that they've given about reprisal attacks. We've got the headline on this that the group has been banned. But what kind of a status really are they operating in? USA Today says that Blackwater's work, according to Maliki, has been halted, but he did not say that its license has been revoked. Can you put some meat on those bones for us?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's an absolutely ridiculous system that exists over there that governs these private security forces. I mean, the United States is occupying Iraq, and the idea that the Iraqi government is licensing private security companies may sound good on paper, or may be some kind of a chit thrown at the Iraqi government. But let's be clear here. Blackwater USA is not going to take orders from the Maliki government. In fact, my understanding is that Blackwater's license to operate in Iraq expired many months ago, and that the company has been unable to renew it anyway. It's almost a moot point whether or not Blackwater loses its license. I mean, if the Iraqi government is a sovereign government, which the Bush administration wants to say it is, and Maliki says these 1,000 individuals need to leave the sovereign nation of Iraq, and they don't do it, it sends a very clear message about President Bush's definition of sovereignty.
Next call is a call from Eugene, Oregon, Democrats line.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Jeremy, I want to thank you for your book, and I want to thank C-SPAN for having the practicing its right for freedom of speech to have Jeremy Scahill on their program. It's amazing, considering where our mainstream media is today. Jeremy, I saw your piece on Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman, and as I've seen several others in the past, I'd like you to speak to the philosophy behind Blackwater and its connection with the mission, seemingly, from people such as Vice President Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and the Bush administration. Thank you.
Thanks, caller.
Well, Blackwater is very much a product of the kind of government that this administration came into power intending to create, and that is to sort of run Washington as though it's like a venture capital firm. Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney both have very much pushed a radical privatization agenda. In fact, Dick Cheney, when he was the Secretary of Defense under George H.W. Bush, one of the last things he did in the aftermath of the Gulf War is to radically expand the civilian support program for the military, the program where civilian contractors are used to support U.S. military operations abroad. And in fact, Cheney hired a division of Halliburton, the company he would go on to head, to essentially perform a study on how to create a market for itself and other war companies. During the Gulf War, the ratio of private contractors to soldiers was about 60 soldiers to every one contractor. Right now, there are more contractors in Iraq than there are actual soldiers. And in fact, Donald Rumsfeld famously gave a speech on September 10th, 2001, in which he declared war on the Pentagon bureaucracy. He said, I've come not to attack the Pentagon, but to liberate it. We need to save it from itself. And he implemented what was known as the Rumsfeld Doctrine. And Blackwater very much is an outgrowth of those policies of radical privatization. And, we need to be clear here. The Bush administration, by using these kinds of forces in such great numbers in Iraq, gains an enormous level of political expediency. The deaths of Blackwater contractors and other private contractors don't get counted in the official death toll. Their actions go largely unmonitored, and they certainly have gone unprosecuted. And so this is sort of a backdoor surge, if you will, that's been going on for all 4 years of the occupation, and it's really doubled the size of the U.S. occupation force in Iraq.
Your book opens with very well publicized around the globe the deaths of the 4 Blackwater contractors whose bodies were mutilated and burned and hung from a bridge for the world to see. Do we have any sort of estimations on how many contractors have lost their lives in Iraq?
We do. First of all, Blackwater itself has lost somewhere between 25 and 30 of its operatives, although the company doesn't always publicize when its men are killed. Oftentimes we learn about it because of the kinds of incidents that we've seen unfold in Iraq over these 4 years where contractors are killed, like the Fallujah incident that you mentioned. There's a federal insurance program called that operates under an act of Congress known as the Defense Base Act that was passed in the 1940s. And basically what it says is that contractors who are serving the U.S. military abroad and are killed or injured are entitled to receive benefits. And we know that over 1,000 families of contractors killed in Iraq have applied for federal benefits under the Defense Base Act. So a minimum of 1,000 of these contractors have been killed. But I have to say that the vast majority of contractors who work for the U.S. government in Iraq are not U.S. citizens, and there are layers of subcontracts. So that 1,000 is just a fraction of the number. And when you add that to the U.S. soldier death toll, which is somewhere in the ballpark of 4,000, you realize that it masks the human cost of the war in terms of U.S. lives.
Exeter, New Hampshire, Republican line.
Hi, thanks. I have your book. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to dig into it. I'm looking at Pelton's book right now, License to Kill. But a comment you made at the start of the program with regard to the owner of the company, Eric Prince, his religion and his political background. Why is that more important than his professional background, which, if I understand correctly, he was a Navy SEAL? If correct me if I'm wrong, and I had understood that, read somewhere something that he was part of the counter-terrorist unit, SEAL Team 6. And isn't that the main focus, or do you think it's that he's a evangelical Christian, or however you termed it? Which is more important? Thanks, and I'll listen in.
I think that Blackwater has a number of reputations around the world, and certainly within the U.S. national security apparatus. I think a lot of other private military contractors in Iraq view the company as arrogant and its operatives as sort of cowboy tactics. But the fact is that Blackwater also is viewed as the sort of elite Maserati of the industry, if you will. It's not the biggest company, it's not the most profitable, but it certainly does provide a number of elite former Special Forces operators to the U.S. government. Mr. Prince himself is a former Navy SEAL. Blackwater does hire a lot of former Navy SEALs in Delta Force, and that's a major part of why the U.S. government wants to work with them. The flip side of it, which the caller raises, is that Eric Prince himself and his extended family have been deeply involved with funding politicians whose belligerent policies have made Blackwater's meteoric ascent to prominence within the war on terror machine possible. And I think that on the issue of the right-wing evangelical Christianity, one of the reasons why I do think that that's relevant in the current political context is that Eric Prince is a member of a board of an organization that says very clearly that they believe that the Bible is the only infallible word of God. Another executive at Blackwater openly declares his membership in the Military Order of Malta, a Christian militia dating back to the First Crusades. And when you deploy forces with leadership like those men in a Muslim country, and you say you're trying to win hearts and minds, I think it sends a contradicting message. So it's not about the religion as much as it is the politics, or anyone who declares their religion to be supreme over everyone else's.
Next question comes from Little Rock, Independent Line.
I'd like to know why the government doesn't take some kind of responsibility. I don't understand why the people will stop fighting each other, why they obviously have for 5 years seen these convoys coming and going, things like that, and they should stay clear of them. They know how dangerous these situations can erupt. They have been more adversarial, it seems, amongst themselves instead of pulling together as a government. Please don't make fun of Mr. Maliki, but he is in power. It is his country, and they do contracts and things like that. He should be supported somewhat in his decisions. What's the bottom line if Blackwater and other agencies like that are pulled out of the country over there? Can that government pull together and run their own country? And thank you.
Thank you.
Well, it's interesting because both General David Petraeus, who's overseeing the surge in Baghdad right now and recently testified, and Ambassador Ryan Crocker have been very clear that they believe that the occupation would not be tenable if it wasn't for these kinds of private forces. But in order to get to the heart of the question that the caller raises, we would have to look at this in an entirely different way and ask a very simple question. Is there going to be peace and stability in Iraq under a U.S. occupation? I've spent a lot of time in Iraq myself, and I tend to think that the major and primary cause of violence right now in Iraq is in fact the U.S. occupation. And when you add to the 170,000 or so U.S. troops, 180,000 private contractors who are totally unaccountable, have not been prosecuted for their crimes, and operate in a climate where immunity and impunity go hand in hand, I think that's just a recipe for escalating violence. And we've seen Blackwater specifically be at the heart of a number of horrifying incidents that have resulted in massive blowback against U.S. troops, massive loss of Iraqi lives. After those 4 men were killed in Fallujah in March of 2004, the Bush administration launched a revenge assault on the city, leveling Fallujah and sparking a massive Iraqi resistance that haunts the occupation to this day. Right now, it's unclear what's going to happen if Blackwater doesn't leave the country. But this situation, we just heard testimony from Ambassador Crocker and General Petraeus a few days before this incident, talking about how things were looking rosy now in Baghdad and getting better, and then this happens. I think we're in for a very bloody several months now as a result of this incident.
Auburn, New York, Republican Line. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Yeah, I just saw this guy on my favorite show, Amy Goodman. And the guy asked him that was on there what a definition of international terrorism is, and he still calls them, would you call them some kind of radical name? I'm surprised all these people on here have read a few books like Ronald Radash's book, A Journey Through the Old Left, New Left, and the Leftover Left, because that's where this guy's coming from. And David Horowitz, this guy's a left-wing guy. He hates Blackwater. I mean, the guy was a former Navy SEAL. And this goes right along with Bouvard.com's ad about General Petraeus. I'm a World War II guy, and I don't believe these guys were around during World War II. They were saying Roosevelt was a traitor and a warmonger, Pete Seeger, singing songs about Roosevelt. Can you believe it? And he got not only that.
Caller, let me jump in at this point because you've made your point. Thank you. Mr. Scahill?
Well, I think that the antithesis of American democratic values is playing out right now in Iraq. I mean, if the caller believes that he wants Blackwater to speak for him with its unaccountable actions in Iraq, then that's certainly his right. But I don't think this is about being left-wing or right-wing or being a Democrat or a Republican, liberal or conservative. I've had many people who identify themselves as traditional conservatives and scores of veterans from the Iraq War who've come up to me and expressed their outrage at this system of unaccountable mercenaries in Iraq. And in fact, I've talked to many U.S. troops who've just gotten back from the battlefield in Iraq, and they say that these guys operate like cowboys and they make their lives much more difficult in the war zone. And they ask what message is their country sending them when they're being paid $40,000 a year to be in some hellhole city in Iraq. And then they see the mercenaries whiz by with their six-figure salaries, sometimes with better equipment and better body armor. And we have kids over there who are bolting steel onto their Jeep. So if the caller wants to defend Blackwater mercenaries for their unaccountable actions in Iraq, that's certainly his right. But I think it's very patriotic to be a dissenter, especially in the times in which we live.
Would Blackwater talk to you?
No. In fact, I tried to get interviews with executives of the company, but I did once interview the number 2 man at Blackwater, Kofor Black, who's a 30-year CIA veteran, the man who led the hunt for Osama bin Laden, and one of the key figures involved with the extraordinary rendition, the government-sanctioned torture and kidnap program. I was able to talk to him at a mercenary conference very briefly about Blackwater's operations inside New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And I actually ran into Eric Prince, the owner and founder of Blackwater, and I tried to question him on why he wouldn't provide answers to the families of the 4 men who were killed in Fallujah. Those families are suing Blackwater now for wrongful death, and Mr. Prince wouldn't answer my questions either.
How did you get most of your information?
Well, there's a wide variety of sources. I mean, primarily I filed an enormous volume of Freedom of Information Act requests, tried to get as many of the contracts as I could. I talked to sources who are, some of them are members of Congress, some of them are congressional staffers. I talked to former contractors who had worked with Blackwater and other companies. The penalty, though, for a Blackwater contractor talking to a journalist or speaking, revealing any details about the company can be stiff. I believe it can be as high as a $250,000 fine against them. So it's not easy to find people who are willing to talk to you or to say critical things about the company. Also, there have been some tremendous reports that have come out of Blackwater's backyard in Virginia and North Carolina. Bill Sizemore of the Virginian Pilot has done some amazing reporting, as have Jay Price and Joseph Neff of the Raleigh News and Observer. And I think that one of the problems with this system, as I set about to try to paint a picture of this one company, is that even ranking members of the House Intelligence Committee or the committees that are responsible for oversight of U.S. military operations are unable to get detailed information about these companies. And so that's a real problem. And in fact, when my book came out, I had members of Congress calling me, asking me for documents that I refer to or cite in the book. It should be the other way around. It shouldn't be Congress looking to journalists for this. The Congress should be paying attention to this and should have access to these documents.
Next question comes from Pueblo, Colorado. Good morning, caller.
Good morning. And C-SPAN and Jeremy here are doing noble, noble work. You keep it up. I have kind of a two-part thing here. Last week, I saw on my Netscape front page that 2 young Marines over in Iraq that gave a negative report in an interview to a reporter, and I don't have very much information. The very next day the report was released, they were found dead. Does Blackwater ever go after our own people?
Well, I don't know of any instance where Blackwater has gone after U.S. soldiers. There certainly have been tensions between private military contractors and soldiers, and there certainly has been violence that has broken out between contractors and the military. And in fact, the military has identified a very serious problem with some of these private military companies, and that is that they don't coordinate their movements with the U.S. military as effectively as the Pentagon may want them to. And in fact, my understanding from an article by Steve Faineru that just came out in the Washington Post is that Blackwater hasn't even become a member of the coordinating body for the private military contractors in Iraq, and instead monitors its own movements instead of coordinating it with other private military companies in Iraq. There's a very serious problem when you talk about the tension between the U.S. military and these private contractors.
We have just about 4 minutes left with Jeremy Scahill, the author of Blackwater, investigative journalist, joining us this morning from New York City. Next call, Tucson.
Yeah. Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'm just listening. The first thing I heard was what a couple other people commented on, the right-wing Christian comment you had there. And then you sound a little angry. You're kind of like a propagandist for the left wing there. And, I understand the mistakes made, in military operations and covert operations. But, I look at you from the side that's going to side with the left and move on .org. And all your comments are going to be, degrading to the folks trying to take care of business over there. What do you got to say about that?
Well, first of all, on the issue of being angry, I don't see how anyone cannot be angry at the situation that we've seen unfold. We're talking about 750,000 plus Iraqis that have died since the beginning of the U.S. invasion 4 years ago. That's a horrible tragedy, and of course we all should be outraged. I think this issue that people try to raise about they're trying to get the job done over there. Talk to some of these veterans who've come back from Iraq and see what they're saying. There are numerous veterans groups that have started, Iraq Veterans Against the War, of people who've actually been on the battlefield and come back and are speaking out against the war. I mean, what is the U.S. objective in Iraq? Is this where the source of international terrorism is? Right now we have about 4,000 U.S. troops that have been killed in Iraq, 750,000 Iraqis. The situation continues to deteriorate every day. It makes the world less stable, and it ultimately makes Americans less safe. The entire world is against our policies right now, including a majority of Americans and a majority of Iraqis. So whose agenda is being served in Iraq? Well, it's the agenda of the 630 companies that are working for the U.S. government in Iraq right now and making a killing off of the killings.
My notes say you are on your way to Washington tomorrow. Are you?
Yes, I'm going to be testifying at a Senate committee hearing that's looking at the events of Sunday and at companies like Blackwater USA, and there are also going to be a number of whistleblowers that are going to be testifying at that hearing, as well as the mother of one of the Blackwater men who was killed in Fallujah in March of 2004.
It's a hearing organized by the Democrat Policy Committee.
It's Senator Byron Dorgan has organized this hearing.
Next telephone call is from Greenville, Kentucky. Good morning. First, Springfield, Virginia, then Greenville. Springfield, you're on the air.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'd like to say I agree with with what Jeremy was saying. It's not about left versus right. What it really is about is what Jimmy Carter, what Pat Buchanan, what Ralph Nader, what Ron Paul and others have told us, and that's the Israeli Zionist control of this country. And people like Jeremy do not represent the left. They represent Zionist gatekeepers. They will trash Christians, they will trash the USA, but they will never look at Israel, they will never look at Zionism. And I'd like to know, what percentage of these firms have Mossad in them, have the special forces from Israel? Thank you.
One thing I would say when you raise the issue of Mossad is that there have been a number of news reports that have come out of Baghdad in the past few days saying that Iraqis for some time now have referred to private contractors or mercenaries as Mossad, a reference to the Israeli intelligence agency. In fact, there's also evidence to suggest that when the 4 Blackwater men were ambushed in Fallujah in March of 2004, that their attackers actually believed that they were attacking a Mossad convoy or a CIA convoy. And the events leading up to that incident, when those men were killed on March 31st, 2004, included the Israeli military's assassination of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. Fallujah is a Sunni city, and there was a general strike, and that was just a week before those 4 men were killed. So there was a context to the killing of those 4 Blackwater men that very much had to do with Israel's policy of targeted assassinations.
That's it for our time. This, again, is the book, Blackwater. It's on bookshelves around the country if you're interested. Jeremy Scahill, thank you very much for joining us from New York City today.
Thank you.
And now to C-SPAN's live coverage of the House of Representatives for this Thursday.